QD-OLED technology has captured the attention of video enthusiasts since its introduction last year. But even in the year 2023, there remain only two QD-OLED TV brands in most countries, namely Samsung and Sony. Here, on your right is a calibrated 55-inch Sony A95L QD-OLED. On your left is a calibrated Samsung S95C QD-OLED of the same screen size. And on the floor is a Sony BVM HX310 mastering monitor which cost £30,000. Despite measuring similar to the Samsung S95C in terms of peak brightness and ABL or automatic brightness limiter above 10% window size, the Sony A95L managed to extract that bit more light output from the same second-gen QD-OLED panel in real-world HDR content, not only contributing to more impactful HDR presentation, but also coming closer to matching the Sony HX310, whose 1000 nit full-screen brightness is admittedly beyond the reach of even the best consumer OLED television. One reason why the Sony Bravia A95L could get brighter than the Samsung S95C using the same QD-OLED panel is the implementation of an additional heat dissipation layer supplemented by advanced thermal analysis via the Bravia XR cognitive processor. Indeed, when we displayed a peak white window at full blast in HDR for 10 seconds, then switched to a full field grace light, the Sony A95L was able to clear away the resulting image retention in a quicker manner than the Samsung S95C, which is only equipped with stock graphite thermal pad that comes with the QD-OLED panel supplied by Samsung Display. While the default HDR tone mapping setting of gradation preferred on the Bravia A95L tracked the ST2084 PQ standard accurately, Sony's dynamic tone mapping algorithm, which ignores ST2086 metadata, continued to prioritize APL or average picture level over preservation of all highlight detail. So in a handful of HDR movies containing 4000 nit elements, there would be more clipping of bright specular highlights compared to the Samsung S95C, which tone maps based on max DML or maximum display mastering luminance metadata. Even though both QD-OLED TVs use the same second-gen panel from Samsung Display, we have identified other areas where Sony's picture processing gave the A95L a slight advantage over the Samsung S95C. 1. Although both TVs could reproduce most colors to an accurate level after calibration, certain WCG shades exceeding Rec. 709 would appear more correct on the Sony A95L with reference to the BVM HX310 mastering monitor, regardless of whether we calibrated the Samsung S95C to DCI-P3 or BT2020 color space. 2. The Sony A95L had the upper hand in the handling of heavily compressed, bit-stuffed content from broadcast or streaming sources, extracting more detail while suppressing compression artifacts to a more effective degree, helped in no small part by the provision of a dedicated smooth gradation decontouring setting not found on any Samsung television including the S95C. Sony's excellent image processing was not without its compromises though. Even at neutral sharpness setting and with reality creation disabled, Sony's upscaling would apply very mild edge enhancement under the hood except in game and PC mode, which may frustrate the most ardent purist. Also, Sony's video processing was so resource-intensive that it added around 300 milliseconds of latency for 24 frames per second content, which introduced some lip-sync mismatch on our setup, particularly in Dolby Atmos. If you are highly sensitive to this problem and cannot compensate for the delay using your external player or AV receiver, perhaps you can try switching to a non-Atmos soundtrack or to PC mode with curtailed processing, although you may see a bit more judder instead. Going forward, it would be good if Sony could provide a setting to adjust the audio delay through the onboard speakers, whose sound quality was very good by TV standards, especially after running the acoustic auto calibration function, which measures your listening environment using the remote control microphone, then automatically customize the frequency response to the room. There's decent bass response and dialogue clarity, with a highlight being the precise sound localization from the Acoustic Surface Audio Plus technology where sound is emitted from the OLED screen itself. Coming back to color rendition, One aspect still not fully addressed by the Sony A95L was the dark color desaturation we first reported on last year's QD-OLED TVs. Unlike on previous Sony OLEDs we've tested, near black gamma on our retail sample was not over brightened, and owing to QD-OLED's pure RGB subpixel structure, the Sony A95L did not manifest any near black chrominance overshoot artifacts. Taking advantage of the new MediaTek Pentonic platform on the Bravia A95L, Sony has separated its motion flow motion interpolation control into two settings, namely smoothness film for low frame rate content such as 24 frames per second movies, and smoothness camera for higher frame rate material such as 50Hz or 60Hz sports broadcast. Smoothness film can be used to alleviate the mild stutter inherent in 24p films, and even the highest strength of max would apply less smoothing and incur less soap opera effect or SOE than similar motion settings on rival TV models. Although as purists, we will stick to min, or at most 1 in titles containing very challenging slow panning shots. Smoothness camera would improve the motion clarity in 50 fps or 60 fps material, increasing motion resolution from the sample and hold baseline of 300 lines to 650 lines on the max setting. Clearness is 60Hz black frame insertion or BFI, low is off and high is on, which would boost motion resolution to the maximum of 1080 lines on this horizontally scrolling test pattern from the FPD benchmark software disk, but unfortunately also increase flicker and dim the picture, so we prefer to disable the 60Hz BFI at all times. Unlike on previous Sony TVs, Film Mode High was no longer required in conjunction with Motion Flow Custom to extract 24p cadence from the internal TV apps such as Netflix, but naturally you will still need to engage Film Mode to correctly detect and process film-based interlaced material with 3.2 or 2.2 cadences. Taking every motion setting we tested into account, overall we recommend switching Motion Flow to Custom, increasing Smoothness Camera to Max, setting Smoothness Film to Min or 1 if necessary, and leaving Clearness and Film Mode at Low, which should provide the highest motion clarity without flicker for all types of content, while causing less interpolation artifacts than MEMC algorithms from rival manufacturers. As expected from QD-OLED, bright uniformity on our Sony A95L retail sample was pristine, with no sign of banding, dirty screen effect and color tinting even off-axis. On the other hand, dark uniformity seemed to have taken a slight step back from first-gen QD-OLED panels. We tested a 55-inch and a 65-inch A95L, and both units manifested some faint vertical streaks near black even up to 10% video stimulus, which could be seen in certain dark scenes with a uniform background. Screen uniformity does vary from panel to panel, so if you are very sensitive to this issue, you might want to consider buying from a retailer with a generous exchange policy in the hope of securing a cleaner panel near black. For gaming, input lag in game mode measured 16 milliseconds at 60 frames per second, halving to 8 milliseconds at 120 frames per second, a figure which held firm even with VRR engaged. Due to the MediaTek Pentonic 1000 chipset used, only 2 out of 4 HDMI connections are HDMI 2.1 inputs supporting the full HDMI 2.1 bandwidth of 48 gigabits per second, of which 1 is the eARC port. Like all Sony televisions, the Bravia A95L did not feature proper HDIG support, although the auto-populated maximum tone matte luminance and maximum full-frame tone matte luminance values of 18 clicks from minimum were for once quite close to our ideal adjust HDR settings on the PS5 for this TV. Because setting HDR tone mapping to off would deviate from the HDR10 PQ-EOTF standard, and there's always active dynamic tone mapping otherwise, our recommendation is to first disable HDR tone mapping on the Sony A95L, then set the first and second adjust HDR screens on the PS5 until the sun first disappears, which should take 17 clicks from the bottom. As always, the third screen should be adjusted all the way down to black. When playing HDR games, you should then switch HDR tone mapping to gradation preferred to restore accurate PQ-EOTF tracking. VRR worked well to reduce frame drops and tearing artifacts, though some VRR flicker remain unavoidable in certain VRR games, particularly during more sedate scenes and on static menus. Courtesy of the new Pantone SoC, the A95L was the first Sony TV we've tested to be capable of reproducing full 444 chroma in HDMI 2.1 FRL mode, even with HDR VRR enabled. That said, adoption of new hardware would inevitably throw up some software bugs, such as our retail unit very occasionally not kicking into HDR mode automatically with an HDR video source, the custom for Pro 1 and custom for Pro 2 picture presets not being displayed correctly in the Kalman for Bravia app, the user menu becoming sluggish from time to time, occasionally choppy motion upon startup, various Dolby Vision anomalies, all UK catch-up TV apps such as BBC iPlayer currently missing on the UK model. Hopefully these kinks will be ironed out in due course by future firmware updates. Native 10-bit gradation was very good judging from this grey RAM pattern from the Display HDR app. And unlike on LG OLEDs, smooth gradation still worked in game mode to reduce in-game posterization, although we would refrain from going higher than the low setting to avoid an overly filtered appearance. Despite not offering a user setting to disable logo detection dimming, the Sony A95L did not exhibit any noticeable auto-dimming in HDR games containing static elements such as HUD on screen. Interestingly, Sony's logo detection auto-dimming algorithm was more aggressive in SDR mode at higher peak luminance settings. For example, after a few minutes of watching some football with peak luminance set to high, the scoreboard would trigger the logo detection auto-dimming, causing the entire picture on the Sony A95L to eventually look darker than that on a Samsung S95C QD-OLED whose auto-dimming had been disabled through the service menu. Note that this is only a problem if you absolutely need to set peak luminance to high when watching sports in SDR, for instance in a very bright room. Most people probably won't notice any logo detection auto-dimming at lower peak luminance levels. And similar to all Sony OLEDs we've reviewed in recent years, the Bravia A95L did not dim down unnecessarily in prolonged dark HDR sequences. Design-wise, the Sony A95L is supported on a pair of metallic feet at both ends of the QD-OLED panel, with the position and the non-glossy finish preventing reflections from polluting the picture on screen. The back portion of both feet is tilted inwards, preventing it from spoiling your front view. The default low-profile fit configuration gives a premium minimalistic appearance, but you can also opt for a higher propped-up position to accommodate a soundbar or perhaps even a game console. The largest 77-inch A95L gets a third, central stand position whose footprint is small enough to fit on a narrower piece of AV furniture. The Sony A95L suppressed reflections extremely well, but due to the lack of a polarizer in the QD-OLED panel, the screen would turn grey particularly when hit by direct light, even though the tint was more neutral than last year's panels. From our experience, your eyes shouldn't pick up the grayer blacks when there's enough bright content on screen, but please bear in mind that when the TV is off, the screen may not look as black as non-QD OLEDs, depending on the angle at which light hits the screen. The Bravia A95L ships with a premium backlit remote control featuring direct access buttons to a number of streaming apps including Crunchyroll and Bravia Core, the latter of which is a unique selling point for Sony TVs since its introduction in 2021. The Sony exclusive app offers streaming at much higher bit rates, and even IMAX enhanced expanded aspect ratio not available on other streaming services for a handful of titles. Not to mention newly added Dolby Atmos support. To sum up, the Sony A95L represents an upgrade over last year's critically acclaimed Bravia A95K, with around 40% higher peak brightness and a more relaxed ABL circuitry thanks to the latest second-generation QD-OLED panel from Samsung Display, bolstered by additional heat management system implemented by Sony themselves. Together with QD-OLED's very wide color gamut coverage of above 90% BT2020, not to mention high color luminance without wide subpixel interference, this contributes to the most impactful HDR presentation we've seen from a consumer OLED television so far. While there remain some teething software issues with the use of the new MediaTek Pantone 1000 chipset, At least the change of hardware platform spurred Sony to finally introduce global picture settings, along with separate motion interpolation controls for low frame rate and high frame rate content. Of course, every TV will have some deficiencies, and the Sony A95L is no exception. Its gaming specifications still lag behind LG and Samsung OLEDs. Dark uniformity on our review unit wasn't as clean as that observed on last year's first-gen QD-OLEDs, and there's undefeatable logo detection auto-dimming in SDR mode at higher peak luminance settings. Despite these shortcomings, the Sony A95L still delivers the overall best picture quality from a consumer TV in 2023, helped in no small part by class-leading motion, gradation, and handling of heavily compressed material, and so it receives our highly recommended Best in Class award. That said, given that the Sony A95L has only started shipping in late September, it is significantly more expensive than the LG G3 and the Samsung S95C, which have both enjoyed sizable price drops over the best part of 6 months since launch, and some of you may prefer to wait a few more months to see what CES 2024 brings in terms of new TV innovations. If you are undecided about which OLED TV to buy, one place where you can get good advice is at Richer Sounds, a trusted British AV retailer with more than 50 stores in the UK, as well as a secure e-commerce platform for online purchases. If you join the company's VIP club, you will also get 6 years warranty included on the vast majority of TVs. So visit your local Richer Sounds store or online at richersounds.com for your next TV purchase. Thanks again for your support. Now, even though Sony specifies a minimum internet speed of 115 megabits per second before you can enjoy the highest Bravia Core bitrate of 80 megabits per second, ironically, the Ethernet port on the Sony A95L is capped to 100 megabits per second, similar to all consumer televisions on the market. Fortunately, there's a little-known hack to significantly boost the wired Ethernet speed on the Sony A95L by up to 10 times, and you can find out how to do it by watching my demonstration video here.